Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Discussions of Darkness. For those of you who are wondering why I'm dressed up a little bit, this is a little bit of a special episode. Not only is it the 30th installment of the series, which I'm pretty proud of, honestly, I wanted to take a moment to answer some questions about an upcoming podcast project that I've mentioned titled Windy City Shadows. Long-term viewers of the channel would remember that I dedicated the 11th episode to this nearly a year ago, and it's finally looking like it's going to become a reality. So I wanted to answer some questions about it and see if I could get you all interested in getting on board for this new thing I'm hoping to do. Apologies for any unusual background sounds, but it is rather warm still in the season, and I had to leave my window open for recording purposes. So ignore anything unusual in the background. Everything is fine. My studio is in no danger. But let's get to the questions with that disclaimer out of the way. First and foremost, lots of folks have asked the very obvious and very basic question of what is Windy City Shadows? And the short answer is that Windy City Shadows is going to be a narrative audio drama podcast set in the Chicago of the Chronicles of Darkness, or at least a version of it that will be of my making. Now, there's a lot of words in there that I have seen bandied about online, and lots of folks have used them not quite in the correct context, so I want to be very clear because lots of folks have had questions on this topic. This is not a live play podcast. No dice will touch a mat during this particular story. No one is going to be a player. There will be no rules calls. This is an audio drama with a cast of folks, including myself, who will be reading out the roles of characters and putting on a performance for everyone who tunes in to listen. This will also not be live in the sense that we're pre-recording so that we can put in all of these sound effects, all of the background music, all of those things that really make audio dramas pop. For those who have been on the channel for a while, they'll be very similar to the World and Chronicles of Darkness audio dramas I've done previously. And if you haven't listened to the spoken word playlist that we have, I recommend checking it out to really get a sense of what's going to be going on and what things are likely to sound like when you tune in. Now, another thing that folks have asked is which sphere of the World of Darkness, or in this case, the Chronicles of Darkness, I keep using the terms interchangeably, but for those who want to know, this is firmly a Chronicles project. You are not going to see anything from the old world in this show. But they've wanted to know which sphere of the Chronicles of Darkness we're going to be starting with. And for folks who haven't seen any of the stuff I've put out before, maybe this is your first time hearing about the project, we're starting very firmly in the realm of Changeling the Lost. In the first season, at least at the moment, is titled Grim Promises, spelled with 2 M's because I love puns and you all can't punish me for it through the screen. And for folks who are not familiar with it, my hope is that this is not exactly going to be an introduction to the game and world of Changeling the Lost, but I am hoping that the way that I'm writing the scripts, the way I'm putting the characters together, there will be more than enough context for folks who have never played Changeling before, who are not familiar with that particular game and its world and its setup, to pick up what's going on and to figure out the broad strokes, in much the same way that if you were to pick up certain science fiction novels, you might not be familiar with all the tropes of sci-fi as a genre, but based on how characters are interacting and what's being said and the attitude folks have, you can sort of figure out what the story is and where it's going. Fortunately, there's going to be our share of inner monologues for the style of the character. I am foreseeing a very noir setup for this, but that gets us into our next question, because Changeling as a game can vary between the whimsical and the horrifying, and lots of folks have asked how gritty this particular story is going to be. For folks who have not seen the preview and the basic gist I gave of this in various elevator pitches, the setup for Grim Promises is something I have described as modern fantasy John Wick. So we have a protagonist who was once a heavy hitter in the Changeling community, who has since left his post and is just trying to live a relatively peaceful life, who gets dragged back into the blood and shadows of the community, particularly the blood and shadows of the Fall Court, which, for those who are not familiar with the game's setup, is the court dedicated to fear. So there's going to be a lot of grit in this one, not necessarily as much horror. I am not setting out explicitly to make folks who listen uncomfortable. I'm not setting out for jump scares, but there's going to be quite a lot of the old 1930s noir in this. So there's going to be more than a little bit of violence and more than a little bit of mystery for those who are hoping for some high suspense. This is definitely going to be the show for you in between all of the weirdness and all of the magic. If I had to pick something to compare it to, I'd say it's probably more similar to the Hellboy films than it is to anything else. And for those who are wondering which ones I'm talking about, there's only two. I don't know what it is you're confused by. But the next question folks have had after that is, will this be part of a series or will it be a standalone production? And the answer to that is a little bit two-sided, so I wanted to give a more complete and round answer to it. But generally speaking, my intention at time of recording and time of writing, because I have started in on some of the arcs for this particular podcast, is that season 1 is going to be a standalone, full, complete story. The reason I'm doing that is if we get to the end of the first season, which will be a huge undertaking, I'll get to the numbers on that later. But if we manage to get that done, get it out, get it to all of you, and the numbers or the fan engagement just isn't there, and there's not really enough to justify doing another season, I want it to be complete enough that you can listen to the whole thing, and there's no cliffhangers, there's no leading people on, hoping that we get funding for another season. But with that said, I am hoping to turn Windy City Shadows as a podcast into a longer running series. Again, for folks who have not seen the elevator pitches that I've been putting out on my blogs or that I've mentioned in other things, I do have some ideas for a second season and what I'd like to do for future seasons after that. And essentially, I want each season to be sort of its own standalone story, its own standalone narrative. And I want it to be all set, of course, in the Windy City. So it's all going to be in the Chronicles of Darkness version of Chicago that I'm making. But each season is going to jump to a new supernatural community. So while season 1 is Changeling the Lost at present, season 2 is likely going to be following up the conflict that I had in some of my previous shorts between Geist the Sin Eaters and Mage the Awakening. So while there will be references made to season 1, the events will have transpired and they may affect certain people and certain outcomes. There may even be recurring characters. The two plots are not necessarily connected, so the mystery suspense story that we're going to be following in season 1 is unlikely to be tied into the plot of season 2, even if the events that happen may have ripples that go between the two communities, if that makes sense. Or to be more explicit for those who are wondering why I'm being so cagey with the details, the murder mystery plot of season 1 is unlikely to be directly tied to the revenge thriller plot of season 2, even if they will share location and they will share characters. Now, moving beyond that, the next question folks have asked, particularly folks who are interested, but they've been burned by things like this before and they don't exactly want to commit to something, is how long is it going to take between now, when I get people interested in the show, and when I actually come out with it or when they have something they can listen to? And that is a bit of a dodgy question, mostly because a lot of it's going to depend on how smoothly things go. Generally speaking, though, if I were to sit down right now and I wanted to have all the scripts done, I wanted to have all the episodes recorded, I wanted to have everything perfect and gone through and have a group of beta listeners go through the entire series to make sure that it's perfect before I post anything, I am confident I could have the entire first season done somewhere between a year to a year and a half from today. However, as I have recently mentioned over on the Literary Mercenary, podcasts and audio drama setups like this are different from novels in that they don't need to be 100% complete before you start putting out installments or episodes. However, I don't want to give myself too narrow of a deadline, so I would say that with a little bit of luck, I could be posting episodes early 2025 if things go well and if recording goes smoothly, if all of the technology gods are on my side. And then I would have a bit of a buffer between the episodes that have gone up that people are listening to and the episodes that I'm still recording, still editing, still getting ready for release. And as long as I have a couple of months in between when what I'm working on needs to be ready to show up, folks could be getting these installments sometime between 6 to 7 months from now. Again, fingers crossed if all goes well. That is, however, only a statement on full episodes and full parts of the series. It was my intention, before I started releasing those, to put together some interesting, we'll say, palette teasers, but I'll get to that in a minute as to where that's coming from. However, after folks ask, how long will it take? The next question, of course, is where will it be available? And because this is a slightly different format than I have done for previous things on YouTube, it's still going to be available on the Azukail Games YouTube channel. However, that's really going to be the backup for this particular show. So by all means, like, subscribe, head over to the channel, make sure that we're getting all of the attention that we can. But my intention at time of recording is to go through one of the platforms like Anchor, and hopefully that will allow us to get it not just on YouTube, but on Spotify and all of the other podcast platforms out there, so that no matter what device you're using, no matter what service you prefer, you can still check out the show and you can still listen to it free of charge. That is both my intention and a requirement of the Dark Pack agreement rules that allows things like this to be produced. But beyond where it will be available and when it's coming out, some folks have asked what crowdfunding and rewards will be available, because this is not just a passion project of mine. This is something I am hoping to do as part of my profession, part of my career. And these things take time and energy, and bills still need to be paid in between while I'm working on all of these things. So my intention at, again, time of recording, is that Windy City Shadows will have its own Patreon, which will be separate from both the Azukail Games Patreon, as well as my own Patreon of the Literary Mercenary. And a big part of that is because I want to be able to offer specific rewards and specific tiers just for this podcast. The other part is I don't want people who are fans of the show to be funding other things with their money if that's really not what they're into. So while it might feel like over-diversification, I feel that this is a project that is big enough that it really deserves its own dedicated funding stream. There will also be a Ko-fi for folks who want to be able to give tips but don't necessarily want to commit to a full monthly purchase to get things going. Now, as to rewards, this is very up in the air and it's very subject to what I mentioned previously, which is the Dark Pack rules and limitations. For folks who are not familiar with that, or you've never heard of it before, essentially Dark Pack is an agreement that you can sign on to if you're creating a fan project, whether it be a LARP or a podcast or a video or whatever it is you're doing, that allows you to set things in the World and Chronicles of Darkness settings, as well as Exalted and several other properties that are licensed by this company. And there are certain rules and restrictions that come with that. One of those is that you have to make the project you're doing freely available to people, even if you can accept advertising revenue and tips and donations and various things to keep it going. So that does limit you somewhat in what you can offer for rewards to patrons. However, currently, the most obvious reward is shoutouts in the program itself for those who have helped fund it, both visibly and audibly. For folks who have not heard the host of Season 1 of the infamous Mr. Nowhere, it wouldn't just be me reading things over. You would be getting a shout-out from the main voice of the channel and the main voice of the show, who does the intro and the outro for every episode. So that will be a fun little thing for folks who want to kick in and keep it going. I will need to carefully read the rules to make sure that anything I suggest is allowed at the time I put the show together. But I have also considered things like early access for some folks. I need to make sure that that is allowed and doesn't fall under too preferential treatment or too many sales. But things like that are currently being discussed. I have a couple of other folks I know who have run podcasts in very similar reward tiers. I want to get their opinion and their input, and then I want to check to make sure that it is allowed under the rules I have to operate under. But beyond that, and dealing with those limitations, the next question folks have asked is, well, when am I going to start? Because, as I mentioned earlier, if I started today, I could probably have some things in place and ready to go by next year. However, the main reason I haven't started today is the same reason that I didn't start 3 months ago, 6 months ago, or a year ago when I originally proposed the project. And a large part of that is because, as I mentioned earlier, funding is a big question, and I am operating on a bit of a shoestring budget. So, what I am hoping to do is to get the Azukail Games YouTube channel monetized first, so that it's bringing in some revenue. Again, for clarification, this is not my channel. I am the face of it to some people. Adrian Kennelly runs this channel, and he runs the company of I do not own or run Azukail Games. I am just a contributor, and I'm just a writer. But once the channel is monetized, that means that the videos I've made in the past are earning revenue, and it means that there's more company revenue overall to help back bigger projects. And so that also means that having Windy City Shadows available, backed up as a podcast on the list here for people to come listen to on the channel, makes it an investment that is likely to earn money for the company, not just yet another thing taking up space for people to maybe listen to if they have time or energy from it. Now, according to my most recent check-in, because again, it's not my channel, I can't just click the metrics and get them myself, I have to go to Adrian and ask him. We still need about 350 to 370 hours of watched time from you, our lovely audience. So if you want to help get this show started more quickly, the faster we get the channel monetized, the faster I can start working on things for this podcast so that I can make sure at least one of the foundational blocks to help it generate money once it's out and people can listen to it is in place. And more importantly, we overcome any issues we have with demonetization or with age restrictions, things like that. Those are all things that could throw a bit of a spanner into the works, and I would rather have those problems worked out rather than trying to figure those problems out, while also trying to write episodes, record them with a cast, and get all the editing done. Oh, pardon. So, that is a big part of it. However, as I mentioned, in the lead up to the show, I do have a couple of smaller things I'd like to do to really get people's energy going and to really get people interested in what I'm putting together. I mentioned that I wanted to do trailers for the show. I already have 1 to 2 of them in mind to operate as kind of a 3 to 5 minute pitch as to what people are going to be hearing, what they're going to be listening to, and to sort of intrigue everyone as to what the story is going to be. But beyond those trailers for the show, I was thinking about also doing character spotlights so that people who come into the narrative may have a bit of a sneak peek as to who precisely they're dealing with, what is happening, and things of that nature, of whether it be Wolf, the character who has gone missing, whether it be Shepherd Black, the protagonist we're going to be following around, the former enforcer for the Fall Court, and a bit of his shady past. You know, whether it be characters like Amy Prism, who has showed up in other audio dramas, and the performer has offered to reprise her role as the character should she show up in the series. These are all little things that I could put together that wouldn't be as big or as necessary. They're not going to be important for those who are wondering about missing plot, but they'll be a little bit of an intriguing thing with some extra lore in them. So those are some things that I could start on relatively quickly. But again, that's going to depend on how fast the channel gets monetized and how quickly we start putting the show proper together to keep people interested and keep updates going. That actually feeds into the next question folks have had is, will there be any recurring characters? As I mentioned before, I have several audio dramas on the channel for Changeling the Lost, and all of these are dramatized vignettes that come from the introductions to the Changeling the Lost RPG supplements that I have written and published with Azukail Games through the Storyteller's Vault platform. And whether it's characters like the one-eyed ogre Jacoby, whether it is Amy Prism in all of her spring party girl glory, I've introduced several characters over the half dozen, 2 dozen, let's call it a dozen even, shorts that I did for Changeling. And that gave me a bit of a stable of characters to draw on that either I already had performers for or I already know the voice for. And they're sort of part of the Windy City background already. So my plan is to, as the story is unfolding and as we need additional characters, to reach out to people and ask if they would be willing to bring back certain people. And thus far, everyone I have asked has been at least interested in reprising their previous roles, as well as volunteering to take on new ones if that's a thing they would like to do. And so the answer is yes, there will be at least a few recurring characters, with an additional bit of lore of several of the people who have volunteered to lend their voices to this are also people that I have LARPed with in the past for Changeling, and several of their retired characters they have offered to allow me to use for this production. I wanted to say thank you to all of them. That has been astonishingly helpful, offering me characters who I am already familiar with and that I already know what the voice is going to be like, so we're going to have so much less effort getting things together and getting it smoothed out. Now, the last question that folks have brought up about this, and that at first I was a little dismissive of, but it came up often enough that I wanted it included in this AMA because I feel it deserves an actual answer. And that is, why am I choosing to do a Chronicles of Darkness project? Why am I choosing to do something that comes with all of these restrictions rather than just doing something original? You know, why am I doing essentially a cover of an existing property and not something that I made from my own mind or something that is wholly unique to me? And there's a couple of reasons for that. The first and most obvious is, from a professional standpoint, it's a lot easier to get something greenlit and to find an audience for something where there's already an existing base. Folks who show up to a Chronicles of Darkness podcast, particularly a podcast that is dealing with Changeling the Lost, already have some idea of what they're getting into, especially if they are already fans of this particular sphere of the World of Darkness, or in this case, the Chronicles of Darkness. So I'm drawing on a pre-made audience that some of whom already know me for doing Changeling content, and lots of them may have already heard the previous audio dramas that I've done, and they're curious to see how many of those characters are going to show up, what's the plot going to be, is anything that showed up in my previous supplements that I have written for this particular sphere going to show up. And generally speaking, those are all positive things. Especially because that community is one that has already asked, when am I going to lengthen my audio dramas into something that's more than 5 to 8 minutes and give them an actual fully complete story? So for folks who are curious about that sort of thing, there is that pre-built audience. There are folks who are already familiar with my work in this subject and who want to see what I'm going to expand it to. So that is part of it. Another part of it is that, quite honestly, I'm a huge fan of the Chronicles of Darkness, and there are so many things I've wanted to do with these parts of the setting. There are so many stories I've wanted to tell that I just haven't gotten to, either because they're not things that my group was really interested in, or the LARPs that I was part of just didn't have time and space for it. So this is at least partially my way of finally getting those stories out of myself, so that I don't have to ever remake the same character again. But lastly, it's because while it's still going to be a huge amount of work, and it's definitely going to be a bit of a labor of love, it is so much easier knowing the world building, knowing the rules, having all of these things to draw on, rather than having to make all of that from scratch, and then asking myself, where's the audience going? Once I have their attention, what am I going to do with them? Am I just going to use this as an excuse to keep making more seasons of a podcast, keep telling more stories? Excuse me. Or am I using this to drive interest in other projects, other things I've been part of? And for Chronicles of Darkness, I have a relatively large history of RPG supplements. I have other stories I'd like to tell. I have other things that if I had the audience for it, if people were engaged in what I was making and they wanted to help support me making more, I could keep doing that for quite some time. So there's a lot of longevity to this project. As long as there is audience enthusiasm, I'll be able to keep it going for some time. Whereas with something original, something that is more akin to things that, I've been producing in other parts of the RPG world, I may only have a handful of stories before I want to move on from there and do something else. So, hopefully, while that was a little all over the place as far as an answer goes, that does at least illustrate some of what has led me to this project and what I'm hoping to achieve with it, and why doing a Chronicles of Darkness podcast really won out over following up with some of my more traditional high fantasy stuff, or why it was a higher consideration than following up with either my mech pilots fighting dragons in space or my cyberpunk stories that have been going on deep in the bowels of the inner city. But those are the most common questions that folks asked. If there are questions I didn't address, or if something didn't make sense, or if there's something you wish you'd asked before I put this together, make sure you leave it in the comments down below. I want to provide as much context for folks as I can. If you check the video description, you should find some links to previous pitches I've made for the show and other elements that are going to be going into it. So check those out if you have additional curiosities. And if you want to help get this idea off the ground, if you want to make sure that it actually gets made and isn't just something that lives rent-free in my head for the next decade or so, share this video around, subscribe to the channel, and make sure that your friends also see it. Make sure that we get those viewers and subscribers that we need to help justify putting together bigger, more involved things like this, because as PBS says, it's viewers like you that make all of this possible. If there's no one listening, if there's no one watching, we don't really have the bandwidth to keep putting stuff out there. So the more of your attention you're willing to share with us, the bigger and more involved things we can make as a result of all of the, well, bottom line that gives us. So, again, thanks for tuning in, and until next time, happy gaming, everyone. Thank you for staying to the end of this episode of Discussions of Darkness. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking the video and sharing it on your own social media to help boost the signal. And if you'd like to help us keep the show and channel going, don't forget to hit that subscribe button as well. If you have any questions about the topic I covered today, or if you have something you'd like to see covered in a future episode, make sure to leave it in the comments below. Lastly, please check out the link in the video description to browse all of my World and Chronicles of Darkness supplements from Azukail Games. So far, we've covered Changeling the Lost, Vampire the Masquerade, Mage the Awakening, and Geist the Sin Eaters, in addition to a handful of general supplements that will be useful for any game set in the World or Chronicles of Darkness settings. Thank you in advance for your support. You're the ones who help us keep the lights on, so we don't fade into the shadows.